Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this latest online EPRS event. It's focused on the US presidential election. I think there is a rising tide of excitement and anticipation about the contest next Tuesday, and so we've entitled this America's Moment of Destiny, the 2020 US presidential election. And we're delighted to have, I think predominantly in Washington, D.C., a panel of US commentators and experts who are going to give us the latest from the ground as they see it, based on their experience and their knowledge of US politics, in some cases over several decades. They are, in alphabetical order, Carroll, who is Director of Political Research at the Pew Research Center in Washington, Elaine Carmack, who is Senior Fellow in Governance Studies at the Brookings Institution, the Washington-based think tank, Tara Palmari, who is former White House correspondent for ABC News and previously Washington and Brussels correspondent for Politico. And she'll be remembered by many of the Brussels audience for the time that she spent in Brussels a few years ago. Bruce Stokes, who was previously at Pew for many years and is now the director of the Transatlantic Task Force at the German Marshall Fund. And Dave Winston, who's president of his polling and survey research company, the Winston Group, and was previously a leading Republican political advisor, including to the former Speaker Newt Gingrich. We also have two very senior members of the European Parliament who are due to join us. One is Radek Sikorski, former Polish Foreign and Defense Minister and former member of the Polish Parliament and Speaker of the Polish Sejm. He's now chair of the European Parliament's Delegation for Relations with the United States, so the EU side of the Transatlantic Legislators Dialogue. And Tonino Pitsula, member of the European Parliament, who is a former minister in his own country, Croatia, including as foreign minister, and is the standing rapporteur for relations with the United States on the Foreign Affairs Committee of the European Parliament. Joe Dunn, the head of the Washington office of the European Parliament, EPLO in Washington, D.C., will come in towards the end with some closing remarks, and if for any reason there's a technical hitch on this particular call, he will take over and chair if for any reason I cannot. So, I'm looking to see whether Mr. Sikorski has already joined us. If not, he will obviously come on board as soon as he does. Failing that, I'm going to, in order to get events moving as rapidly as possible, I'm going to ask Carroll to open the proceedings and to talk about the perspective from Pew.
Thank you so much, Anthony, and thanks to the panel. It looks like a wonderful panel. I'm looking forward to hearing from them. You know, it's been an extraordinary year, of course, in American politics, but I mean, one of the striking things is that in our polling and in other national polls, at least, there's been remarkable stability all year long. Joe Biden's held a pretty consistent and significant lead in the national polls. That hasn't changed even as we're down to the final days of the election. In our most recent survey, he's up by 10% among registered voters, which puts it in the the range of other national polls. I think it's that stability is one of the ways that it's different from 2016. It was there was much more fluctuation in the national polling in 2016, and of course the biggest change, the most obvious change from 2016, is that we're dealing with this national crisis now, and as the coronavirus cases surge in the late stages of the campaign, this is a real challenge for the president going forward. I mean, in our polling, Biden had an advantage in handling the coronavirus. He expanded that advantage in our most recent survey a couple of weeks ago. 57% say they have confidence in Joe Biden to handle the public health aspects of the coronavirus. 40% say the same about the president. The other aspect of this that's very different from 2016 is that we had two kind of historically unpopular candidates back then, and now Biden has actually improved his favorability numbers over the course of the campaign, and I would just point to one personal dimension, which is honesty. Such a big factor in 2016, neither Trump nor Hillary Clinton was viewed particularly well on that dimension. In our survey, Biden has a 15 percentage point advantage in terms of honesty, a key dimension there. And the final factor, of course, is that the third-party candidates are going to probably have less of an impact. That was a big issue in 2016, and interestingly, many of those people who voted for third or fourth party candidates in 2016 tell us they're voting for Biden this year. Now, of course, this is the national picture. It's all decided by the Electoral College in the United States, as you know, and that's a different picture. State polls show very different things. Hillary Clinton won the popular vote last time by 2 percentage points, and so the national picture only tells you so much. And I would have a couple of cautions about some of the surge in early and mail voting we're seeing. Biden is much more dependent on things going well with these mail ballots than Trump is. Half of Trump voters say they're going to cast their votes on election day itself. Only 20% or so of Biden voters say that. Trump will have an enormous advantage among election day voters. It's important to point out, Biden will have an advantage among the mail voters and those who are lining up now for early voting. It's an important factor as we start counting the ballots on election night. And I would just conclude by saying what an extraordinarily high interest and engagement voters have this time. You know, perhaps the most striking statistic from our polling, 83% say it really matters who is victorious. If you look back to the Bush v. Gore famous election of 2000, the one that was ultimately decided by the Supreme Court and the Florida recounts, et cetera, it was only 50%. I mean, this shows you the extraordinary level of interest, and with a lot of analysts and our data suggesting that this will be a record high amount. And with that, I will conclude my remarks and turn it over to the next panel.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for being so concise and so interesting. Now we've been joined by Radosław SIKORSKI, who's the chair of the European Parliament's Delegation for Relations with the United States, the EU side of the Transatlantic Legislators Dialogue. He's also former foreign minister, defense minister and speaker in Poland, and he's going to give us some scene-setting remarks from a European perspective. So over to Mr. SIKORSKI.
Before a US election, as a chair of the delegation, what I'd love to be saying is that whoever wins, we hope for the best possible relation with the European Union. That would be the traditional way of keeping the delegation bipartisan on the US side. And of course, in the delegation, we have supporters of both candidates. We have colleagues from ECR and even further to the right who are rooting for Donald Trump. But I agree with President Trump that this is the most important election, I would say, not even in living memory, but probably since the American Civil War. And it is particularly important for America's allies here in Europe, because what these 4 years and this election is showing is that the United States is no longer a paragon of a democracy. For us in Central Europe, it used to be customary and self-evident to put the United States as an example to follow of how you do democratic politics. That, I'm afraid, is no longer the case. America is now a damaged country. Its politics are damaged, its economy is damaged, and its society is damaged. And we see the recent relationship with the United States as highly problematic. President Trump famously called us a foe. That was a first, as the European Union. but also on the USA-NATO relationship, there has been mixed signals. On the one hand, he continued President Obama's reassurance initiative in Central Europe and in the Baltic states. The rotational presence of American troops has increased. From our Central European point of view, he also did something that President Obama failed to do, which is to impose sanctions on Nord Stream, which we view as Germany putting its economic interests above the geostrategic interest of all of Europe, and particularly above the interests of other transit countries for Russian gas, such as Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, inside the EU, and Ukraine in particular, outside the EU. But on the other hand, and I think this concerns all of the European Union, he has proved to be an unreliable ally. That press conference with Vladimir Putin in Helsinki, at which he said that he trusts Vladimir Putin more than he trusts the FBI, was really noticed. And his tweets about whether or not the US should come to the assistance of Montenegro also question US commitment to the defense of Europe. On the economic front, we've had, instead of a mature way of resolving various economic disputes, whether on Airbus or Boeing or in some other fields, we've had threats of sanctions, which we've had to respond with counter threats, and that has delayed what I think would be an increasingly needed joint European-American project to deal with the growing power and assertiveness of the People's Republic of China. President Trump made it seem like he wants to fight a two-front war with the EU on the one hand and with China on the other. And I think it's unwise. I think it's counterproductive for the US, but it's also not conducive to a good relationship with the European Union. And the way I see Joe Biden is as someone who is actually even more pro-Atlanticist than President Obama was. He represents an older version of the US establishment, and the people around him are more Atlantic centrist than President Obama's people. So from the point of view of the depth and strength and effectiveness of the relationship between the EU and the US, I'm sorry, I can't be as bipartisan as I'd like to be, because I think that with Joe Biden, we would have a chance to repair it all. I give credit to President Trump on some things. I've mentioned a couple. I would also say that both in substance and on style, I agree with him when he criticizes those European states which have been free-riding on the American security guarantee and not spending 2% of GDP on their own defense. And I think he was right to do it in your face, because when it was done politely, since at least George Bush Sr., it didn't work. And I hope as the EU, we also increase our European defense budget so as to become a stronger partner with the US in bearing the burden of leadership. We should, whoever wins, I'll end with this. we should get serious about all this talk of European autonomy, of geopolitical commission. But I will only believe that we are getting serious if member states start respecting the Lisbon Treaty and allow the High Representative to do his job of representing us jointly on the international scene, and when we start devoting real resources to common defense. 13 billion for 7 years was a good beginning, but that's been cut by half now, and that is not serious. So I just hope that whether to live with a second Trump administration or to welcome a Joe Biden administration, we show them that we are becoming more serious. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. SIKORSKI, for his political scene-setting remarks, which we greatly appreciate and which help set the much bigger context of the choice which is to be made. And we'll be coming back to that later in the panel. Mr. Pitzler will be intervening towards the end. And also towards the end of the immediate panel round, we'll have Bruce Stokes, who of course is a leading transatlanticist. I'm now going to go over to Elaine Carmack from the Brookings Institution. She's a senior fellow in their governance program there and is also heading up their special center, which deals with effective public management. Among her many books are Primary Politics, describing how the US presidential primary system operates, Why Presidents Fail, and The End of Government as We Know It. Elaine.
For having me, and good afternoon to everyone in Europe. I think I obviously would echo Carroll's very, very good summary of where this race is. And a lot of Americans, and I'm sure a lot of Europeans, don't really realize how stable this race has been. Let me just give you an example. Back in January, Biden was leading Trump in the polls, even though people in the Democratic Party didn't even think Biden would be the Democratic nominee. I mean, they thought he was, as we say, dead man walking. Okay, so that happened. Then the pandemic happened, and he still led. Then the killing of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter happened, and he still led. So there's been a lot of turmoil. This has been quite a year in American politics and society. And this steadiness in the polls has been, frankly, fairly remarkable. And I think it goes to the perception of Donald Trump's, incumbency. Let me also add that whether it's Europe or the United States or any other established democracy, elections are basically about incumbents. They're always about incumbents. And so this has been an election that is basically about Donald Trump. It is not surprising that he's in the shape he's in. He never once crossed 50% in approval ratings of the American public. So he's been a deeply divisive president. And on top of that, he has maintained a strategy, not just in his campaign, but throughout his presidency, of playing to his base exclusively without attempting to broaden his base. It was particularly evident in the 2018 midterm elections, where all the Republican operatives were urging him to talk about the economy. And what did he do? He turned the 2018 election into an election about immigration, which basically turned off a lot of suburban women and, cost him the House of Representatives. So looking forward, let me give a few ideas about how to view election night, which I guess for you guys will be the middle of the night, but you may stay up late, or you may get up early in the morning and see a bit of it. First of all, we have a problem calling states this time, and the problem is that so many people are voting absentee, and not all states will have those absentee ballots counted by election night. Some states actually forbid the counting of absentee ballots until the polls close. So this is a real patchwork situation. On the other hand, Florida, which is in the Eastern time zone, it will report early, allows absentee ballots to be counted 22 days before election night. So when we see results from Florida, we will have a pretty good idea where the entire race is going. First of all, the results, early results from Florida should include a lot of absentee ballots. And as Carroll indicated, a lot of the absentee ballots are going to be Democratic votes. So we'll see that happening. Trump beat Hillary Clinton in Florida by 1.2 percentage points in 2016. So you can kind of have a look at Florida early on and say, well, how's Trump doing? Is he where he was last time? Is he doing better than he was, or is Biden doing better? So we will be able to kind of see where this is going. Secondly, and this is playing off Carroll's comment about Trump's terrible ratings among the public on honesty. Trump, in these waning days, is seeking to cast doubt on the honesty of the entire American election system. This means that he has to convince, he who is not regarded as honest, is going to have to convince Americans that somehow this whole election is, stacked against Donald Trump, that there's massive corruption. There's never been any evidence of this. American elections are remarkably honest. There are many, many checks and balances in the electoral system itself that helps keep it honest. We are fortunate in that the pandemic, which started in March of this year, was in full swing for most of the primary season, which means that individual states, and they're the ones that administer elections, by the way, the federal government in Washington does not, individual states have had several months now, and they've had a trial run about how to run an election during a pandemic. And so they are making adjustments. They've made adjustments in vote by mail. They're hiring extra workers. They're buying more scanners to scan these absentee ballots and paper ballots as they come in. And so I think that the Trump strategy of casting doubt on the honesty and integrity of the election is going to run up against a bunch of states that are frankly prepared for this. They've had time to prepare and will be able to report election results. With that said, it could be a long night or it could be a week. And that depends on whether or not these margins we're seeing from Joe Biden are as big as they are. Once Joe Biden passes 270 votes, and remember, he basically starts with 232 votes because no one expects any of the states that Hillary Clinton won to move to Trump. Once Biden passes 270 votes, even if there are other states that are in doubt, it won't matter. We will have a president-elect. So my estimate is we will have a president-elect at maybe on election night, and at the very latest, probably Friday after the election. And I say this because I recently was on a call with the secretaries of state from Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Ohio, 3 closely contested states. And they all said, well, we think the longest it will take us to count all the votes will be Friday after Election Day. So I think the early anxiety about this has dampened somewhat. But it is in Trump's interest, obviously, to try and cast as much doubt as possible on the election process.
Thank you very much indeed for that. We've now been joined by 2 more panelists. We've been joined by Mr. Tinian Pitsula, who is, of course, the standing rapporteur of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the European Parliament on transatlantic relations and former Foreign Minister of Croatia. welcome. We're running slightly ahead of schedule, so if you'd like to make any immediate remarks before your closing remarks, you're very welcome to do that. We've also been joined by Tara Palmieri, who's an investigative journalist and reporter, has previously worked with ABC News, with CNN, and with Politico. And some of you may remember that she was a very active reporter in Brussels when she was with us here in Brussels about 4 or 5 years ago. Mr. Pitzula, would you like to say anything at this stage?
Thank you so much for inviting me. I would like also to greet everyone invited, as well as everyone, of course, who is following this, I guess, very substantial, important panel here. Just to mark a terrain in a way, there is no doubt that the upcoming US elections in the moment of destiny for transatlantic partnership, and to great extent multilateral order in general. Until recently, the US and European Union were each other, I would say, mediums for political action on a global scale. And that cooperation has come under pressure in recent years as US policy has largely moved away from earlier positions. And the policy of the Trump administration were highly disruptive to this order and to transatlantic relations that sustained it. Of course, now it's a great expectation that Biden's victory next week may be a turn of the tide. And we all are looking for it, because a multilateral profile of EU and multilateral way of thinking and acting is in DNA of the European project as such. That's the reason why we are so interested to see changes in the Oval Office in Washington.
Thank you very much indeed for those remarks. Much appreciated. And now, Tara, how do you see the election shaping up?
Back. I thought in 2016, when I was based in Brussels, like I just felt this real tide, this populist wave on your side of the ocean, and just there was a real enthusiasm and excitement for Trump that I don't think the media really captured. And I think that that was the same thing with Brexit. I don't sense that same enthusiasm for Trump this time around. And I don't think that, and I also think that Hillary Clinton, we underestimated her, I guess, dislikability factor. And especially among women, suburban women. And I sense that this time around that those same voters will are coming out early to vote, first of all, and that they are voting for Biden. I think that it's inevitable that he will be the president. I think it'll be really difficult, but you never know at the end of the day. But it just seems that this time around, if Trump loses Michigan, Wisconsin, I mean, Texas might be blue. I mean, that's absurd. And I think that you've already seen sort of a foreshadowing of this in the midterm elections. So, I mean, obviously most incumbents, sometimes they end up losing the House, sometimes they end up losing the Senate, but it was just such a massacre in the House that I've got to think that, states like Arizona that never had Democratic senators have a Democratic senator right now. It looks like they're going to have another one. So 2 Democratic senators representing the state of Arizona. It's unheard of.
Thank you for that. Since you were for some years, I think, a White House correspondent with ABC News, can you just share with us a little bit the personal style of Donald Trump and how that is affecting not only American politics generally, but the race in particular, because he campaigns in a very, very different way to pretty much any other American politician that we've ever seen in the past. And is that traction still something to really take into account in these closing days?
Yeah, Trump has this it factor, I guess you could say. I mean, he was a celebrity. He was a celebrity on The Apprentice. He speaks in that kind of way that, that charismatic way that a lot of fascist dictators speak in, kind of shoot from the hip populism, saying what everyone's thinking, but he can't be controlled. And it's really his inability to control himself that has caused a lot of the landmines that he faced throughout his presidency and, you know, even in the election. And I think Americans are getting a little tired of it. Some of the lies are just so out, like flat out. I think that the White House said that they had beat coronavirus the other day. I mean, you really, it's becoming absurd. And I think a lot of Americans now know what it's like to have someone in their family or someone close to them that has had coronavirus. So it's changed. This could topple any president, really, a pandemic like this, any sitting incumbent president. But when you've got one that was already really, you know, losing favorability, it's not surprising. And, you know, his management style has always been the same. He manages the same way he campaigns. He does whatever he wants. He doesn't listen to anyone. He acts impulsively. You know, the shoot from the hip style of campaigning, it ended up that was his presidency. And I think we all wondered during his campaign, would he switch over? Would he become presidential? And I think a lot of the independent voters in those swing states, they also thought that he would become presidential, and they didn't see that. They also thought he was going to bring big, beautiful healthcare. They didn't see that. A lot of his promises were not, he never made them. Instead, he spent the first 2 years just appealing to his hardcore nationalist base, which is 30% of the country, but that doesn't win you an election. So, you know, with the Muslim ban that he instituted within the first day, you know, that was all just a way to appeal to his base to make sure that they come out and vote. Even if they come out and vote, it's the swing states that he lost. Like even that comment he made the other day to suburban women, don't you want your husbands to have jobs or something like that? And it's like, you've totally lost it. I mean, you really clearly make America great again back in like the 1950s. He has no idea. And I did some reporting on the ground speaking to these suburban women, and they're just like, we care about healthcare. This is number one. This is the most important to us. And this is in Virginia, in what was forever a red state. And this district was a red district that became blue. And it's like, they just feel like there's a disconnect. He doesn't speak to them.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you very much for that, Tara. Next in our panel, and there's a kind of natural segue, in fact, to Dave Winston, who is a professional pollster and has worked for a large number of Republican candidates over time, and is, I think, the official pollster to the Republican leadership in the House. What's your take on the way things are playing out?
You have to address that it's sort of under these sort of circumstances. Well, the country's never been in this level of circumstance. We literally shut down our economies. We literally shut down our entire education system. People have been living at home for 6 months. So there's a little bit of guessing going on here because we're trying to sort of create where are things in an environment where we've never been in a situation like this. So I think that's an important place to start. With that, sort of the state of the race at this point, and as a result of that, is that people have really sort of honed in on that. There are two basic issues that are going to decide this. One is obviously the coronavirus. The other is the whole sense of how do we restart the economy. And those are not separate issues. They're integrated. And this has been the challenge for both Biden and Trump. And that is this concept of a transition point. At what point can you actually begin the transition from not having to worry about the virus as much to the economy? And kind of where the electorate has emerged here is they actually trust Trump, and you see this pretty consistently in the polling in terms of who do you have more confidence to handle the economy. They trust Trump to, in fact, deal with getting the economy back on track as we get through this transition. The problem the electorate has had is they're not confident that actually Trump can get us to that transition point, and that's sort of the critical piece here. And as a result of that, Biden has had the advantage in terms of people believe he can get us to that point. They're not as sure about he can handle the economy post that, whereas they're not sure Trump can get us to that point. So therefore, what's the point, right? You know, you're going to rebuild something that doesn't. And so that's the dynamic that exists between the two of them. As a result, Biden has had a pretty consistent lead. At this point, looking at the polls, national level polls. That lead ranges anywhere from 5 points to 12 points. Although, again, for Trump, the economic news this morning, where GDP in this country grew 33.1% in the third quarter, certainly is going to be sort of a boost. But as Elaine Carmack was pointing out, we had a really good jobs report just before the 2018 election. Actually, Joel Bernstein basically said it's about as good a jobs report as you can get. And then instead of focusing on that, as she referenced, he focused on the caravan, the immigration issue, which was not exactly the best outcome, as you saw what happened to Republicans in 2018. Having said that, the one thing that I want to talk to, particularly in terms of that 5 to 12 point margin, since 1856, and that's the first Republican versus Democrat election, there have been 41 elections. Of those elections, 10 have been 3% or closer. Of those 10, 4 were won by the person who did not win the popular vote. So basically, when an election is within 3%, it really becomes this state-by-state environment. If you're looking at something larger than that, 5-8%, that's where you get into it. There aren't enough coalitions built sort of across groups that allow the state by state to come into full play. And what you've seen certainly in terms of where those key voter groups are, they're basically two. You're looking at women, I take it beyond just suburban women. I think it's a broader component, particularly in terms of Republicans. Republicans lost women in the 2018 elections by 19 points. So this is that's not a performance that can be repeated and expect that you can build a majority coalition by any stretch of the imagination. And they represent, actually, women aren't a minority group. They're a majority of the country, 52%. And the other is obviously the non-affiliated in terms of independents. Again, Trump won them by 4 in 2016, and most of the surveys I've seen, he's not matching that level of performance. With that, there is, however, a volatility in the electorate, and there are two pieces to that, and this is sort of as we go to the close. Things to observe. The first element of volatility is just simply people are looking for solutions from leaders. One of the challenges that most political campaigns, or the challenge that represents to most political campaigns, is the sort of political doctrine from both parties at this point is the thing that you do in political campaigns is define and attack your opponent. The idea of offering solutions is something that's basically somewhat foreign to political operatives because they prefer just to simply attack the opponents, because that's also a good way to raise money. There are all sorts of, but what the country is looking for is solutions, right? They don't want to hear why this person's so bad and what bad things they're going to do to the country. Their attitude is things are pretty tough as they are. Tell me how you're going to fix it. That's a challenge of both campaigns to be able to accomplish. The other element of volatility that exists here that is different from last time, as was pointed out before in the last campaign, about 18% of the electorate had unfavorable views of both Clinton and Trump. And this is from exit polls, media exit polls. And Trump won those voters decisively, 47-30. And that was a key component as to why he was able to win the Electoral College. This time around, Biden's negatives are nowhere near the same level as Hillary Clinton's, although he doesn't have a great fave on fave, but in contrast to Donald Trump, it certainly looks better. And that elevates the second challenge that Donald Trump is particularly facing, which is 1 out of 5 people who voted for him in 2016 had an unfavorable view. And so his first step is to, in fact, re-engage those particular voters and try to change that image. Whether he's done that or not, I mean, we'll obviously see next Tuesday. But again, the broader construct here, as we sort of go forward, and I just want to remind everybody in terms of the political makeup of the U.S. electorate, and this is from the 2016 polls, that you don't necessarily see in social media, in cable. 21% of the country, this is 2016 from exit polls, 21% of the country were conservative Republicans, 18% were liberal Democrats, and the remaining 62% was everybody else. So when you take a look at the two party bases, even if you put them together, they don't come close to being a majority. And the challenge to both parties, and this is just the dynamic, we'll see who does this, is how do you build a majority coalition? And again, going back to how do you build a majority coalition in an environment that no one's ever been involved in trying to, in fact, do that within. So we'll see what happens on Tuesday. I would say at this point, Biden has the advantage. However, the news today in terms of the GDP will certainly help Trump. And the challenge for Trump is to get that ballot test close enough so that state by state comes into play.
Great, thank you very much. And very interesting, those figures you cite concerning people's kind of self-identification in the electorate, because we have this impression outside of America of an extremely polarized alignment at the moment, but it may well be that that's to do with where politicians are lining up rather than necessarily where the electorate itself is lining up. Now, we're looking to Bruce Stokes from now the GMF to give us a slightly broader perspective of where this leaves transatlantic relations. I mean, the outcome in either way, whether it's Trump or Biden wins, what are the implications for the future of transatlantic relations in your view? Over to you, Bruce.
Thank you, Anthony. It's great to be with everybody. I see some old friends. And before I start, I'd like to echo something that Radek hinted at or referred to. I was doing one of these last night with the Japan Institute of International Affairs, and a Japanese professor who's an expert on the U.S. said on that Zoom meeting that he felt that the way the U.S. conducts this election and the post-election period is essential to America's image in the world, and that he said Japanese increasingly pity the United States because of the way we're conducting our democracy. And I think Americans in particular do not fully appreciate that our soft power is at stake, not in terms of necessarily who wins, but how we conduct this. And I think that it will be a test of American soft power that we should not ignore. As Anthony said, I direct a task force organized by the German Marshall Fund and funded by the Helmut Schmidt Foundation to look at what can be done in transatlantic relations after the election in 2021, comprised of 8 Europeans, 6 Americans, chaired by Karen Donfried and Wolfgang Ischinger. We interviewed 150 people for this task force report. And clearly it matters who wins in terms of what can be done. Among the recommendations that we have made, we looked at 6 different areas of issues that we thought could not be successfully addressed unless Europe and the United States work together in the future. The first one is obviously the pandemic. If Biden wins, we think that it's possible to build a stockpile of medical supplies across the Atlantic, similar to what NATO stockpiles weapons, or we stockpile food, we stockpile petroleum, we should stockpile medical supplies for future pandemics, create a rapid response team to go to areas that have these pandemics to try to contain them before they spread to Europe and the United States, negotiate with other countries a responsibility to report so that we have more transparency going forward. And the U.S. should, if it has left, rejoin the WHO and seek to reform it. Climate is the existential crisis we both share, but we certainly recommend that the United States rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement if it has, and that should be possible because Biden has promised to do that on day one. What is more nebulous is we recommend a greater commitment of recovery spending to climate resiliency. And it will be one of the tests of the Biden administration, assuming Biden wins, whether his commitment to the climate will mean that more of the economic recovery money is spent on climate-related renewable energies, et cetera. We obviously are both in a deep economic recession, despite the most recent U.S. Third quarter economic data. We're still down compared to where we were before the recession began. And certainly as we move towards more lockdowns in the U.S., we'll probably go deeper into a recession. You well know the problems in Europe. We recommend, and again, it's probably going to be more likely that a Biden administration would be willing to spend more money on the recovery. Right now, the U.S. Congress has not been able to get a new pandemic spending bill passed. We recommend coordinating planning now for the unwinding of the spending and the state ownership involved in some of this, because we know in transatlantic relations this has always been a problem. That we coordinate better on antitrust and foreign investment screening, because again, those can cause frictions between Europe and the United States. We recommend the negotiation of a bilateral deal between Europe and the United States, of what we call blue-green free trade agreement that involves medical equipment and supplies and environmentally sensitive technologies, remove all tariffs, remove all trade barriers. We think it's urgent to resolve the digital taxation issue because this is a real potential problem. And both Europe and the United States need to resolve this because we both need revenue going forward. We certainly recommend fixing the WTO. It's broken as a dispute settlement mechanism. It's broken as a negotiating forum. And we also recommend more plurilaterals within the WTO system, where Europe and the United States take the lead in doing agreements among people who are willing to commit rather than trying to develop a multilateral agreement, which of course we haven't really done for 30 years. China is another major challenge we both share. We actually recommend that the United States take the Borrell proposal that has been accepted by Secretary Pompeo for a working group on China, but elevate it to the vice presidential level to give it more political clout, bring in the Defense Department, bring in the Finance and Treasury departments, bring in the Commerce departments, that we agree to organize our economic relations with China as on a basis of reciprocity. That we should demand reciprocity on the treatment of foreign investment, on the treatment of intellectual property, on the treatment of technology transfer. And we believe there is great opportunity for Europe to work with the United States in pressuring China on human rights. The public opinion data that Pew has done, for example, shows this very clearly. Technology is another looming issue for U.S. relations with Europe. It is both an opportunity and a threat if we don't manage the opportunity correctly. We recommend joint funding of emerging technologies. Gone are the days when we have the adequate resources and scientific talent and market size to go it alone. We need to work together to compete with China. We recommend updating the Wassenaar export control agreement to include emerging technologies. And of course, we need to rapidly negotiate a new privacy agreement because of the European Court of Justice invalidating the current agreement. And finally, security, which has obviously been in the bedrock of the relationship for 7 decades, because both Europe and the United States are going to be hard pressed for military budgets because of the recession. We recommend getting off this debate over the 2% and focus more on modernization spending. We're also committed, although no one pays much attention to it, to 20% of military spending being on research and development. We should push that part of the agenda, extend New START, re-engage with each other before we re-engage with Moscow and Tehran, and come up with some common approaches to both Russia and Iran going forward. Obviously, if Trump wins, this agenda gets much narrower. I had a Republican foreign policy expert who I interviewed, who I asked him, since he'd been involved in the Bush administration's efforts to restart the relationship with Europe after the Iraq War, what did he think a second Trump administration could do? And he just got a big smile on his face and burst out laughing. I think we have to be realistic. If Trump wins, what can be accomplished? But I think there are some things we could work on. The responsibility report recommendation, I think, would be something that the Trump administration has been very angry about lack of transparency on the pandemic. On climate change, we already have significant subnational cooperation on climate change. Clearly, if the U.S. is not going to be part of Paris, we need to try to incentivize subnational cooperation between cities and regions across the Atlantic. In the economy, I think the U.S. would be willing to continue to try to fix the WTO, to do more plurilaterals. There's no love lost in the United States about platform companies, just as there's no love lost in Europe about platform companies. Maybe we can begin to do more joint antitrust enforcement and wrestle down this digital tax issue. On China, reciprocity is a word Donald Trump uses all the time in dealing with China. We can build on that together. As I said, the Pew data shows that there's public support in the United States among Republicans and Democrats to deal with human rights issues with China, even if it hurts the economic relationship. One could build on that with the Trump administration. On technology and security, it does seem to me that there are opportunities also for cooperation, given on what the administration has already been willing to do on New START or on export controls. So I think there is an opportunity to work together more effectively on some of these key issues if Trump is reelected. Obviously, there's a broader range of opportunities if the Biden administration comes into office. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Bruce. I'm going to take already now some questions that are coming in and invite our panelists to respond to them. And I think there's a very natural segue actually between what you've just been saying, Bruce, and one of the first questions that we received, which is from Isabel Vizsla Lima, MEP. And she really asks a general question of how important is the European Union these days to the United States, and how valuable can it be for America to have Europe on its side, given the soft power and indeed in some areas smart power of the European Union globally. And the second question that she asks, which I think is fascinating, is on the assumption that Biden wins the election, there's obviously going to be the transition period. And what is going to happen during that period? And could President Trump have a few surprises up his sleeve? So I would suggest, first of all, to ask Bruce to come in on that, and then Mr. Pitzler to come in on that, and then wind it out.
Well, I mean, I do think it's a terribly important question, that latter question about what could happen in the transition period. Bear in mind, we'll have almost a 3-month transition period. That this is a product, again, of a 21st century practice, a 21st century country like the United States trying to govern itself with 18th century practices. There had to be a long time between the election and the inauguration in the old days in the United States because it took that long for people to get to Washington. But there is a need, understandably, for some kind of transition. And I think we don't know whether Trump would decide to pursue a scorched earth policy because he lost, whether he might decide he really has not shown great interest in governing for 3.5 years, and that he would just abandon the idea of governing for the next 3 months and begin to plan his post election career. But the one thing we do know is that there are so many of the positions in the Biden and the Trump administration that are empty or that are filled with political appointees, not career people, that one of the vital things that happen in a transition in an American system, where the professionals prepare briefings for their successors, get them up to speed on what's going on, et cetera, is not likely to happen, frankly. And the challenge that the Biden people will face, assuming Biden gets elected, is that the federal career bureaucracy has been decimated during the Trump era. Lots of positions left open, lots of people forced out, and repopulating the U.S. bureaucracy at all sorts of levels. The State Department being certainly one of them, but a range of other is going to be a real major challenge. Just a minor example, I was reading this morning, there have not been this few inspectors from the Occupational Health and Safety Administration for 45 years. So we go back to the 1970s to get that level of inspectors. That's a minor issue, I know, from maybe for Europeans, but it's a huge issue for the American workforce. And just repopulating is going to take a lot of time, and scaling up U.S. re-engagement in the world is going to be a real problem as a result.
Thank you very much for that. Mr. Pitzula, have you a perspective on that you'd like to bring to bear?
Yes. But what's the substance of the question? Can you repeat it?
Sorry, it's to do with how, in your perspective, how important in today's United States is the European Union to America, and how far can Americans use and see Europeans as potential allies on global issues?
Oh yeah, it's very important and a very general question. It's very hard to say what might happen in the near future. Of course, it depends on the outcome of the next week elections. However, I guess it's my prediction. A clean return to the past is neither possible or even desirable, and some of the colleagues have said so. United States pivot towards Asia and particularly China, I guess, will continue regardless of who wins the White House in any day now. I guess Democratic administration may do it with a greater tact and regard for the opinion of the European allies than a Republican one, because it's very hard to divide where Trump's organization ends and where Republican Party begins. It's a very, very odd mixture right now, but that represents a long-term structural shift. The European Union has to strive to redefine the relationship as the one of the, if it's possible, equal to equal. And I heard some American colleagues who is claiming that it will be, in a way, a more than welcome change, equal to equal, and to explore what is good from our previous cooperation and where and how to upgrade it in these pretty notorious and tough conditions. And I think that means investing more in European Union strategic autonomy. Part of this approach boils down to boosting to European Union security and defense capabilities, but those should not be assessed from Washington narrowly in the terms of the military spending and some kind of the European selfishness. Other tools of influence to make world the safer and most prosperous place, such as diplomacy, trade, and aid, should be equally important in our future cooperation.
Thank you very much for that. Now, questions are pouring in, and one of them that's caught my eye is from Adam Isaacs, because he was in fact going to ask, or is asking, exactly the same question that I was going to ask at some point, which is, what about the other races in on the 3rd of November? We have obviously the whole of the House of Representatives and just over, in fact, a third of the Senate up. And there's been quite a lot of attention here in Europe on the 6 or 7 what they're called toss-up races in the Senate and which way they might go. And what's interesting, of course, is that although some of those states in the Senate, which are very close and in play, correspond to states which where it's perceived that the 2 presidential candidates are very close, not in every case. So, in fact, in terms of the presidential race and the Senate race, you've got a larger number of states that are very much in contention, and then we've got the House. So for our polling experts, how do you read that? Maybe we start with Elaine. What's your perception of these races? There we go. Yes.
Okay, good. It all really does depend on Biden's margins, okay, and whether the margins are outside of that 3% as they look to be or not. What we've seen in recent American elections, in national elections, is that people are tending to vote straight tickets again. They're tending to, if they vote for a Democrat for president, they're tending to vote Democratic for Senate and for House. And so it looks like if Biden's margins are as big as they are right now in the polls, it looks like the Democrats might take the Senate and add to their majority in the House. We're also seeing a peculiarity that we haven't seen very recently, which is strength of down ballot races helping the presidential race. So, for instance, in Maine, of all places, there's a congressional district where the Democratic candidate for Congress is running way ahead of the Republican candidate, and that alone could boost Biden's numbers. In Arizona, some people think that the Senate candidate, the Democratic Senate candidate, is doing so well that he will in fact boost Biden's numbers. So it looks like if there is a big Biden sweep, it looks like he will have, at least for the first 2 years of his presidency, he'll have a Democratic Congress, which of course will make it a lot easier for him to get some things done. Let me go back to an earlier question, which was, what can Trump do in this transition period? I happen to have, just coincidentally, there's a piece I wrote in the Los Angeles Times this morning on that very topic. And the one thing we can be pretty sure he will do is he will pardon a lot of the people in his administration who were sent to jail for various crimes. Beyond that, it is inconceivable that he will pass any legislation that is not overwhelmingly bipartisan. And I do believe that there will be a stimulus bill passed shortly after the election. It will be retroactive. It will be pretty big. And Donald Trump might not be able to stop it from happening. So that is the amount of damage that he can do in this long 3-month period, as Bruce made reference to, which is a throwback to the 19th century. The amount of damage he can do is really quite limited. There are even prohibitions on rulemaking and executive orders 30 days, 60 days, I can't remember exactly, before a presidential transition. So I'm sure he will rant and rail a lot, but in terms of actual governmental policy, I think he's fairly limited in this period of time.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry, I'm just having a problem here with my mute. Thank you very much for that. That's extremely interesting. And in fact, maybe we'll break off on the question of what the outcome of the races are to just pursue this thing about what could happen during the transitional period, because I think it's a really interesting and provocative issue. And maybe Tara, I mean, you saw the president close up when you were following the White House in the White House press corps. I mean, how do you think he would react as a human being, and what would be the political consequence of that to losing the presidency?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I just think that Trump, after the election and likely during the transition and until the end of time now, he will be just sort of this like yapping voice on the sidelines, still actually leading the Republican Party, whether they like it or not. Trump has hijacked their party. They did nothing to stop him and to separate themselves. And so Trump will continue to be the voice of the Republican Party, and he'll use his platform as the president during that transition period to continue to, promote himself as a de facto leader. Who knows? He might even say he's running again. Like, this guy's, we can't think in like sane, terms. But yeah, I don't think Trump is going away. I know news organizations are planning to have reporters covering Trump after the election if he doesn't win, because they've just assumed that he's not. We can't get rid of him. Like, I mean, I guess they could take him off Twitter, but it would be crazy if they just shut down his account on January 21 during the inauguration. But yeah, he's not going away, and it's really the fault of the Republican Party. They'll all disavow him. Well, some will. It depends on what his popularity looks like. And when we truly get the polls back, when it all sets in, I think we'll know more. And COVID, what is winter going to look like? If it's really brutal and he's barely leading us during that period of time, that could have some severe backlash on his favorability. But then again, like he said once that he could literally shoot someone on, I think it was Park Avenue, and they would still vote for him. There is a certain core base of right-wing Republicans who will stay with him, their ride or die. You know, there are a lot of people that go to these rallies not wearing masks. You know, it's absurd. So yeah, he'll still have a base.
So there'll be a long shadow, even if he's lost the presidency. Let's continue the round of electoral perspective on this. Dave,
could I add one thing to Tara's point before we go on? We should remember that Bill Clinton, who left office actually quite popular, still in his waning days after the election, tried to see if he could go to North Korea to get a deal done. He ended up going to Sharm el-Sheikh to try to get a deal done in the Middle East. These guys hold on to history as long as they possibly can. And certainly in foreign affairs, they have an ability that they don't have in domestic affairs, as Elaine points out. I mean, there are some limits to what Trump could do in a lame duck period. But I also wanted to caution our European friends. Even if the Democrats win control of the Senate, they will only win by a couple of seats, probably. And that may very well limit Biden's ability to get some things done that are very near and dear to Europeans' heart. I mean, I think a very ambitious climate change agenda might be difficult to get through the U.S. Senate, even if there are Democrats in control, simply because there are a number of Democrats who would face re-election peril if they're too tough on fossil fuels, they're too tough on coal, et cetera. Doesn't mean they couldn't. The mood of the country has changed, but the likely chairman of the Senate Energy Committee will be the senator from West Virginia. Now, getting a carbon tax past that guy is going to be really difficult. So I think we have to, Europeans should have some limited expectations, even if the Dems win control of the Senate.
Thank you for that. Maybe Dave, how does it look from your perspective, both in terms of Senate and House races?
Well, I mean, the Senate is the sort of major unknown here at this point at a whole bunch of different levels. Right now, Republicans have 53 seats, and the Democrats have actually 46, but Angus King from Maine conferences with them. So it's a 53 to 47 margin. Having said that, there's one immediate likely Republican pickup, and that was the unusual outcome in terms of the special election in Alabama. That's likely to go back and be Republican. So you're looking at Democrats having to pick up at least 4, and if you're assuming a Biden victory, they need 4. If Trump wins, they would need 5. And there are more vulnerable Republican seats at this point than Democrats. The 6 clear seats that people focus on are Arizona, North Carolina, Colorado, Maine, Iowa, and Montana. Of those, Montana was a situation where Steve Daines, who's the Republican incumbent, in that particular situation just got unfortunate and drew a very strong Democratic candidate, the former governor Bullock, the Governor Bullock, who's running against him. The one advantage that Daines has in that particular race is Bullock had been in the Democratic presidential primary and probably said some things that may have worked for the national Democratic primary audience, but may not be so appealing to a Montana electorate. In terms of the rest of the others, Democrats have a little bit of a lead in some of those, Arizona, Colorado, Maine. In North Carolina, the Democrat had the advantage, still has a little bit of an advantage, but in the middle of a scandal, and Iowa's pretty dead even. So when you're looking at the Senate, it's just really unclear what the ultimate outcome, but there are two outcomes too in terms of this. There's the outcome is it close enough, if let's assume a scenario here for a second where it's 50-50, Biden has won, so the 51st vote is going to be Harris. Basically what happens at that point, the one person who bounces back and forth in terms of issue positions a lot is Joe Manchin, as was alluded to before. Basically, if it's 50-50 with Harris, Manchin runs the Senate. And I mean, he'll just control it, and there's one big vote that matters then at that point, and that is the first thing that my expectation the Democrats are going to do is try to get rid of the filibuster. And again, the filibuster, the way the Senate rules work, someone will propose something at a legislative level, and the chair will rule that under the filibuster you can't do that. Someone will question the chair, and that's just a majority vote. So that's how the filibuster gets overturned. That's going to be the big thing to look at. So there are three results. Republicans hold the Senate, Democrats hold the Senate, but don't have enough to overdo the filibuster. Democrats win enough seats to, in fact, get rid of the filibuster. So you need to look at it in terms of those three levels. Right now, it's unclear who can even win the Senate. So it's going to be a interesting, where it's really going to extend for a couple of days after the election, certainly, is who won the Senate.
Thank you for that. I'm going to pass over to Carroll, but I've got a question which I'd like to inject in here, which is, I see that among the states is South Carolina, Lindsey Graham, now being considered in contention. Has Lindsey Graham's move to the right, because many of us associate him with a different era when he was close to John McCain, has that backfired politically? But Carroll, what's your perspective more generally?
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting transition, interesting evolution. It's a close. The polling suggests it's a close race with Graham with a modest advantage. This is a red Republican state. I think it would take a real blue wave for the Democrats to be really competitive in South Carolina and to beat Graham. So there's a lot of money coming into his opponent. Record fundraising there for a small state like South Carolina. You'd still have to say that Graham has an advantage. And I think his handling of the Amy Coney Barrett hearings as the Senate Judiciary Committee chairman kind of helped him in the closing month of the race.
Thank you very much for that. I'm now going to pick up on a couple of the questions which have been asked, and they're coming in here. One is from, I think, a former MEP, Margarita Starker-Vichutu. There are some opinions that Biden could be weaker than Trump on the international stage, and that he could be more favorable to Turkey, Iran, Russia, China. What are your views on that subject? We also had a similar kind of question in a way from Lima and Andrea Fienni, who said, how is Biden, if he gets elected, going to strengthen transatlantic relations? Well, I think Bruce gave us a very, very interesting kind of potential agenda there. It would be fascinating to know how far you think that would actually be picked up. But specifically wants to know more about Biden's policy on China. So maybe, Bruce, you could pick up those questions.
Sure. Look, I think that to my mind, I mean, it depends what you mean by tough. Will he be as tough as Trump? I think he will be forceful in different ways, and I think that I have some good friends. One who is the former chief international economist for the AFL-CIO, our major labor organization, and another friend who's the former chief international economist for the United Auto Workers. Neither one of whom I would call necessarily pro-free trade. And I ran into both of them recently and separately, and they both separately said, Trump is doing everything I've ever wanted us to do about China, and it scares the hell out of me because they realize there's no strategy. It is all episodic. And I think that Biden will be tough on China, both because I think there's been a shift both in public opinion in Carroll's Pew surveys. The disapproval of China in the United States has never been as high as it is now. And there is a commitment to be tougher, especially as I mentioned on human rights. But I also think that Biden will be constrained by his own natural constituency. If he wins, it will be because he got at least some white manufacturing workers to vote for him who voted for Trump in 2016. And to keep those voters, he can't roll over on China. He's going to have to figure out a way to keep the pressure up on China, maybe in ways that don't shoot the American economy in its foot, which is one of the things that Trump has done on with his tariffs. And I think the touchy thing is going to be, how do you say, for example, maintain pressure on China for its steel overcapacity, which is flooding the world market and causing all sorts of distortions, without imposing tariffs that also hit Europe or Canada or our allies? That's not an easy task, but that's the kind of challenge he's going to face. But he will be tough in the process. Now, that said and done, Carroll's surveys also show that while Republicans strongly favor in the United States being tough on China, even if it hurts economic relations, only about a little more than a third of Democrats support that. So there is some room for him to maneuver around China on toughness. It's not at all clear to me that Trump has been tough on Russia. So I'm not quite sure what the question means. While Trump has been very tough on Iran, again, the question is it a toughness that leads to a resolution of the challenge posed by Iran's nuclear weapons program, or is it a toughness that is actually leading Iran to restart its nuclear weapons program? And I think that the Biden people will want to work with Europe to not just rejoin the JCPOA, but to upgrade it, to improve it. And of course, that again requires Tehran to be willing to play ball. And what would happen if Iran decided they can't trust the United States, and even if Biden's president, they're not going to get back into some negotiation? I don't think we know, but I think that's going to be the challenge.
Thank you very much for that. I'm going to keep moving on with the questions. We've got a couple of questions here that relate to American culture and society. And I think one of the things that outside the United States has been highlighted by the events of 2020 is the tension at the heart of contemporary American society. The first question is from Lisa Brenner about racial injustice. How big a deal is that in terms of the potential outcome of the election? Whose advantage is it playing in favor of? And the second, which is potentially linked, is about education in the United States. How important is the educational agenda in current American politics? And what conclusions do people draw about educational alignments in terms of party support? So maybe Elaine first.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. I keep forgetting to do that.
We're all making the same mistake. Go ahead.
You got me now? Yeah. Okay. Racial injustice is a constant in American politics. I mean, it has infused our politics since the beginning of the nation. So it's always there. It is in stark. It's right at the front in this election because, of course, Trump himself has basically been somewhat sympathetic to white supremacists. I mean, you can't get around that. The interesting thing is the generational change that's going on in America. The millennial generation is the biggest generation since us baby boomers. We turned out to have a lot of children, even though no one thought that was going to happen. And this enormous generation is also the most diverse generation ever in American history. Okay, it has more people of color in this generation. So you saw this. You can also call them the Obama administration. They came of age in around 2008. In the first Obama campaign, young people went for Obama over 60%. And the other age groups basically split. So you see this generation, they're very different than their elders on a lot of dimensions. And I think as the baby boomer generation leaves the electorate, us political scientists say that as a nice way of saying we die. Okay, as the baby boomers leave the electorate and the millennials become then the dominant generation in American politics, I think you're going to see some real differences in American culture, particularly around race, frankly. The other thing I can say about that is that, and we've mentioned this before, Tara has spoken of it, there appears to be a rather big deal happening with women in America. It turns out that this movement of women to the Democratic Party, which we first saw in the 2018 midterms in very stark numbers, we're not quite sure what's going on there, but we think that a lot of that has to do with sort of a repulsion from Trump's racism, his sexism, and his just the sort of hostile bullying attitude that he has and way that he behaves. And so women may be, and this is some of my colleagues at Brookings have written about this, women may be in the forefront of the first gender realignment that we've ever seen in American politics. In other words, a massive change in party identification based on gender. And so I think all of these things kind of move into one. Now, in education, I think there's something also interesting happening. Trump's strength, of course, is among non-college educated whites. And as we move on, again, demographically, that is a shrinking portion of the electorate. They're turning out in big numbers, but that is a shrinking portion of the electorate. And of course, the college educated portion is a bigger portion of the electorate. So to the extent that we've seen partisan divisions along educational lines, that too may be changing as new age cohorts enter the electorate.
Anthony, we have some data to back up what Elaine said, especially about race when it comes to race and gender. What's happened over the last 4 years is not that Trump supporters have changed their views. They haven't at all on these topics. But when you compare Biden supporters today to Clinton supporters in 2016, much more progressive on race, more progressive on the role of gender, the obstacles facing women, things like that. It's very interesting. It's status quo for the Trump supporters.
Thank you to both of you. Tara, what's your take on racial injustice, education, and indeed women?
I mean, those are all categories that Trump has not only ignored, but in some ways, in many ways, created more tension around those issues. You know, it's going to continue to be a problem in a Trump presidency. And I mean, the Republican Party is going to have a really hard time getting back women. That's a fact. And they lost them in 2018. They will have a hard time losing them again. I mean, they will have a hard time getting them back. You know, what's interesting to me actually is, you know, a really large voting bloc is the Latinos in America. There's 50 million, and they're low propensity voters, but it looks like they're coming out in larger numbers this year, and that's part of the reason why Texas might end up being a blue state. And they're coming out in Arizona and other places, and they're not. The interesting thing too is that they're not all single-minded voters. Like in Florida, Trump has been speaking to the Cubans and the conservative Latinos over his entire term. He's been visiting Miami. He has it's convenient because it's near his club in Palm Beach, but he's always sort of zeroed in with the socialism message. And actually his approval ratings are actually higher with Latinos from Cuban background in actually all Latinos in Florida. I mean, not all, but like he's up 30 from, I think it was like 28 points with them, and now it's 33. But he's losing them in other parts of the country. And, it's another base that the Republicans worked really hard on for a long time. And it looks like they're slipping away. And these are, some of them are more conservative Latinos who had been in this country for a long period of time. So, it'll be interesting to see what kind of impact they have, because they're just offended by what he's said about their race, and obviously the separation of children has had a really profound impact on them as well.
Dave?
Well, starting off with women, one of the dynamics and in terms of this, and I go back to 2010, and I tend to look at 2010 is when Republicans won the House, so they basically built this majority coalition. In 2018 is when they lost it. And so you went from actually Republicans in 2010 won women by one, and in this is according to exit polls, and again in 2018 lost them by 19. Again, as I sort of identified before, you can't lose a majority of the electorate by 19 and expect to be able to build a majority coalition. But while everybody was focusing on suburban women in terms of where the shift had occurred, and again, I'm going to use that where the majority was built and then where it fell apart. In 2010, Republicans won suburban women by 8, and then in 2019 lost them by 8. So that was a 13-point swing going from +5 to -8. What was interesting that a lot of people haven't noticed is amongst rural women, in 2010, Republicans won them by 25, and then in 2018 won them by only 4. So we actually lost 21 points with rural women, and the suburban women loss was 13. Having said that, suburban areas are 3 times as large as rural areas. So there's, in terms of just mass quantity, there are more suburban women than rural women. But part of what I saw in terms of that was that what the Democrats were able to effectively do, particularly in 2018, was focus on the issue of healthcare, specifically around pre-existing conditions. Rural women were already struggling in terms of access to healthcare at that point. The repeal of the attempt to repeal of what is known as Obamacare, the ACA, clearly had a negative impact in the sense of, okay, fine, you're going to get rid of it, and we're not necessarily particularly wild about it, but what's the replacement? And so for women across the board, it was the sense of this crucial issue, and there's no actual position of what would be done, what we want to get rid of. So that had a huge impact. So one of the dynamics there is, and no surprise here, is that Republicans are finally going to have to come up with the infamous healthcare plan. In terms of education, education has had at one level a sociological impact, because all of a sudden all these kids are their children are at home, right? And there was not a sense of preparation of being able to manage your child's education on a day-to-day basis. Distance learning has not worked. I was on the web-based education, the Presidential Web-Based Education Commission back in 2000. I ended up going through the report, taking a look at it, and actually a lot of the recommendations we made in 2000 unfortunately still have standing today, and that just gives a sense of what the education system needs to be just generally is modernized. In terms of race relations, we'll actually potentially get a clear sense of that on the exit polls. In terms of the questions being asked, they ask what's the most important issue. And they've actually expanded the list out to 5, and it includes races in terms of race and inequality. So we'll get a sense in terms of the electorate where they actually place it. So folks who are interested, go take a look at the exit polls the day after the election, and you'll get a sense of what standing that issue had in terms of how people have made up their mind.
Thank you for that. And now, and thank you very much both to Clara and Lisa for those 2 questions that prompted that round. which was great. I'm now going to take a clutch of questions that relate more to foreign policy and international relations that have come in. Marek has asked a question about if there's a second Trump victory, what, if any, effect might it have on internal unity within the European Union? Which I think is a very interesting question. Mauro has asked, does President Trump in fact have some unsung achievements? For example, what's going on in terms of agreements between Israel and various Middle Eastern countries, and are there others that one ought to give him some credit for? And then Ifrik has asked a question about how Biden would handle Brexit. So maybe I'll ask Mr. Pizzula when he returns. Maybe Bruce in the first instance. Do you have any thoughts on those particular questions?
Well, you know, the question on European unity, and I mean, I think that, you know, it is one of the things that, as we focus on the U.S. election, understandably, even if Biden is president and is arguably more predisposed to work with Europe on a range of issues, there is still it's incumbent upon Europe to get its act together. You know, we don't know what the impact of Brexit will be, and we don't know what impact there will be, because as Germany gears up for another election and Chancellor Merkel is walking out the door, does that create a void in Europe? Now, Macron wants to fill that void, but whether he can or not is another question. You know, in Brussels, you know better than I do the internal fights over the budget and the spending and the political ramifications of all these lockdowns that are now taking place. And I think that with all of our focus on what it could mean, depending on who becomes the U.S. president, what we have to acknowledge to ourselves is that Europe has to be able to better speak with one voice, has to better define for itself what autonomy, strategic autonomy, and technological sovereignty, et cetera, mean for Europe. Because certainly to many Americans' ears, that sounds like a desire to go it alone, and I think most Americans think that's ludicrous. But how we define that new relationship depends a lot on how Europe is able to pull itself together, and that's still to be proven, basically.
Thank you very much, Tara. You'd like to come in on that?
Yeah, I mean, some of the things that Trump accomplished, I mean, he got certain members of NATO to pay more for their, you know, contribution, which, like, at the end of the day is something that all of our leaders have been asking for. So we have to give him that, right? A lot of the things that he did in Europe, I mean, he threw out TTIP, but that wasn't going anywhere anyway. So it's sort of hard to say, like, likely Biden will join WHO, Paris Climate Accord, and others quickly. So I do think a lot of it is reversible, and you know, it also kind of, I don't know how much of a priority will be, especially trade, because trade deals are very unpopular in the U.S., even among the Democratic base. And as we know, Biden is a populist Democrat. He's a union guy. He's kind of like an old school liberal union guy, and it won't be something that he makes a priority. Let's just say that right away. But I do think that he wants to bring everyone forward with the Green New Deal and unionize it, and that'll be his main priority probably in the first few months, and you know, restoring what's left of Obamacare.
Thank you for that. Mr. Pitzler, I wonder if you'd like to come in on any of these issues, the potential impact of a second Trump term on intra-EU unity, what Biden might do on Brexit, and do we underestimate in some way the actual achievements of the Trump administration? Mr. Pizzula.
Yeah, of course. I mute myself this time. Yeah, it's a complex question, and answer we can try to find analyzing policies of the Trump administration, which were highly disruptive to rule-based multilateral order and to transatlantic relationship that sustain it. It goes without saying. Trump's, how to say, transactional style in international relations, neglect of the interest of the European Union allies, support for Eurosceptic far-right forces working to undermine European project from within. Just mentioned Brexit. He was pretty passionate about Brexit. Support for Orban. The other day, Hungarian Minister of Foreign Affairs openly opted for Donald Trump in op-ed. Relation to Polish government, other extreme right parties. He showed indulgence with the authoritarian leaders like Putin, Erdogan, Mohammed bin Salman, and others. And what to mention, withdrawal from the multilateral agreements and organization like Paris Agreement, Global Pact on Migration, World Health Organization, and what is especially dear to European Union diplomacy, it's a JCPOA, or Iran nuclear deal. And all that contributed to severe undermining of the multilateral order. And I do hope, and I'm not naive, to believe that Biden can, in a way, erase all consequences after 4 years of the Trump. But I'm scared, and I don't want to even think what might happen in the next term of the Donald Trump in the Oval Office, if he continues to do what he has done in the first 4 years, especially because the European Union is passing through the pretty important period of time. We need to set a number of internal issues we are disputing about, starting of multi-annual financial frame and other distribution of internal mechanism of the power. And without certain assistance coming from the other bank of the Atlantic, I think European Union situation will be much more complicated.
Thank you very much for that. We're kind of now reaching the end of the round of questions. We've got 2 or 3 more in. There's one I propose to pick out, which I'll ask, if I may, in the first instance, Elaine to reply to. And then I'll ask each of the panelists to briefly come in one after the other with some quick concluding remarks. And then I'll hand it over to Mr. Pizzula to try and pull together some of the issues. And then finally, Joe Dunn, the head of our Washington office, will close the proceedings for today. But the question that's come in, which I want to pose in the first instance to Elaine, is from Tatiana, and she says, could you comment please on possible outcomes of the election for the impact going forward of the leaderships of the different political parties? And do you see essentially this as a staging post in America which is more polarized, or which over time will come back together again?
Well, let me, there, can you hear me? Okay, that is a great question, and one which many of us are thinking about right now. Obviously, if Trump has a big loss, a landslide loss, more than 270 electoral college votes, Republicans lose the Senate, and Democrats pick up in the House. The Republican Party is going to go through one of these, we call it the come to Jesus moments, where they've got to look at themselves and say, what is wrong? I was part of such a moment for the Democrats way back in 1988, after they had a series of losses. And it's hard for a party to do this, but they will have to do it. I agree with Tara that Trump will continue to be out there tweeting and spewing hatred and conspiracy theories and all the stuff that he does. It will probably be even more intense because he will be psychologically having to cope with having lost. And one thing we know about Donald Trump is that he hates losers. So he can't possibly let himself be defined as a loser. So that'll be stirring up that base. But the fact of the matter is that there is generational change. his base is old. His base does not, he has never made significant inroads among young people. Even in the evangelical community, which has stood by him, first of all, it's losing members. And secondly, younger evangelicals are simply not as hard over on issues like gay marriage as their parents are. So I do think the Republican Party is going to have to come to terms with generational change. Secondly, and I'm picking up again on where Tara was talking about, Latinos are a huge piece of the American population, and the reason we haven't seen them participating in very big numbers in past elections is for a very simple reason: they were young. Okay, that was the young. Latinos are among the youngest portion of the American electorate. So my colleague Bill Galston and I, we've been watching the Latino vote for 30 years now. We looked at each other after the 2016 race and said, "Oh my God, they're finally out of high school." Okay, they finally grew up. So you can expect now the Latino population to have more and more of an impact on American politics. And here the Republican Party has a problem. With the exception of Cubans in Florida, the Republican Party has gotten themselves into a hole with Latino voters, which they're going to have to dig themselves out of. So you can see a dynamic in the coming years where there's Trump out there blathering and spilling hatred and lies and white supremacist dog whistles and all the stuff that he does, trying to keep his base alive and motivated to participate in elections, particularly Republican primaries, versus a younger generation in the Republican Party who's saying, "Oh my God, how can we win elections? How can we win some of these swing seats?" On the Democratic side, let's face it, Joe Biden is old. Okay, so it's a question of whether he'll even run for re-election in 2024. And on the Democratic side, we do see a resurgence on the left wing of the Democratic Party, people who would like to move the party farther to the left, who even use the term socialist, which, God forbid, was never something that Democrats like me ever even breathed, let alone said. That's not where the Democratic Party has been. And so the Democratic Party will face its own generational reckoning in the coming years as a younger generation, which is more left-wing than the baby boomers, comes into power and changes somewhat the composition of the Democratic caucus in the House of Representatives. So both parties are going to have to adapt as the baby boomer generation, which has been so dominant in American politics for so long. As the baby boomers become less important in American politics, there's going to have to be adaptations in the leadership of both political parties.
Thank you very much for that. You said it was a great question. If I may say so, it was a great answer. So let's do a quick tour de table for the other colleagues who come in now with some very succinct wrap-up remarks. Carroll.
Well, a couple of points. Pivoting off of what's already been said, I think don't ignore the Senate elections next Tuesday. I know the audience here is very, very engaged and sees the importance, but Biden's success as a president will be hinging on this taking over the Senate for the Democrats. I think that's so important. You saw it the last time they had unified control. It didn't last very long under Obama, and they did get some things done, but it didn't last very long, and it proved to be a problematic time for Democrats, and they ended up losing not only the House and Senate ultimately, but in state legislatures across the country. So this will be a governing test for them. The other point is on polarization. I think, with the higher engagement and higher interest in this election comes a sense that a loss is just devastating, and both sides share this. 90% of Trump supporters, 90% of Biden supporters tell us that the other candidate winning would not just be very concerning, not just be bad for the country, but would inflict long-standing harm on the country. I think when you see attitudes like this, it's going to be hard to patch this up when the election's over, even for someone like Biden, if he wins, who's one of whose goals is to unify the country.
Thank you for that. Dave?
I think one of the important elements here, potentially longer term in terms of working through, and this is probably not unique to the United States in this regard, has been sort of the role of social media, and just the whole dynamics around that. And I think to some degree, there was always the sort of hope that, you know, and at some level has occurred of social media and the internet giving people a voice. What's happened is, and this is where I think the polarization has been amplified to just a massive scale. If you're a media entity and you can get 2 million people, you have potentially a viable business, right? And so what you're trying to do is say things, and those tend to be more outlandish and more outlandish, so you can lock in those 2 million. And then you start playing a role in the overall political discourse. Well, the thing is, if you're trying to build a majority coalition in this country, 2 million people makes you an asterisk, right? You need 60, 70 million people supporting you to be a majority coalition. Yet our media is structured that successes are if you can get 2 or 3 million. And what they're doing is, it's sort of like, you know, the whole line in terms of it bleeds, it leads. Well, except we've taken that to steroids. Right? I mean, you can't just simply say an unusual statement. You have to make an outlandish statement at a scale that attracts people who want to come watch you. And what that's done to the political discourse in this country has really ripped it apart. And somehow we've got to figure out how to have effective political discourse in this country if we're going to sustain a democracy. And I have to say, as we've looked through this election, one of my concerns and hopes, and I have a hope in terms of it, is that post this election, we can begin to really think through as a country, how do we get back to a decent political discourse?
Thank you very much for that. Tara?
Yeah, I think they're absolutely right. This is a defining election. Every time there's an election, we always say that, but I really think so this time. And I do, like I said before, I feel that it will be tough for President Trump to win this. And, you know, I don't know if this was mentioned today, but we may not know right away. And so we may not know on election night what's going to happen, but I think we'll know within a few days, because you have to get to 270 essentially to win. And right now, it looks like it's going to be Biden. So things will change in Europe, but I don't think it will be so rapid.
Thank you. Bruce?
I guess the thought I'd like to leave with people, and let me preface this by saying, I think Biden's going to win. And my personal view is I hope he wins. I think it'd be best for transatlantic relations. But if we wake up Wednesday morning and Trump has won, I think we have to understand that, as a Republican consultant said to me, Trump's goal is not to broaden his base, it's to deepen his base. And he will have successfully deepened his base. And by that, I mean that there are more people in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, who are lowly educated white people who did not vote in 2016. They are natural Trump constituents, and they did not vote. There are more of those in those key battleground states than there are college-educated people or minorities. So if he wins, he will have succeeded in mobilizing those people to turn out to vote, just as he did in 2016, where he succeeded in mobilizing people who hadn't voted in years or maybe never voted in their lives to come out and vote. If he can get more of those people, there are more of them in those key battleground states. And I think a telling indicator of maybe the possibility of him succeeding is that he, in Pennsylvania, there have been more new Republicans registered to vote in this cycle than there have been Democrats. In my home county of Pennsylvania, which went 2/3 for Trump in 2016, and you would think they can't really get more Trump voters in that county than 2/3. In fact, they have registered an additional 10,000 Republicans in that county as opposed to an additional 1,300 Democrats. Now, we don't know how those people will vote, and we don't know if they'll turn out to vote. But if he wins, that's how he won. And we probably can't discount the possibility of that.
Thank you very much for that. And thank you to everybody who asked questions. And as you can see, they've prompted a really exciting and stimulating range of answers. And I'm going to now ask Mr. Pitzula to come in and try and draw the threads together and set out what's at stake for Europe in the choice ahead in the United States. Over to you, please.
Thank you, Mr. Tisdale. I would like to thank the distinguished panelists, attendees of this EPRS roundtable. Of course, it's absolutely challenging to try sum up all what has been said during this very substantial roundtable, just 5 days ahead of the US election. I can only underline some of the points made. I fully agree with the colleague SIKORSKI on the importance of these elections and his hope for the change in the Oval Office. Despite the stability in national polling and consistent lead of Biden, we learned to take it all with certain precaution up until we see the actual results. I'm certainly more encouraged hearing all of our speakers using different concrete data who predict that the change will eventually happen. I fully share the observation on how these elections are a test of US soft power. There is a trend of similar deteriorating perception of the US democracy in Europe, not only Japan. Our citizens support closer cooperation and common solution to our common problems. As Mr. Stokes said, we should re-engage with each other before we engage with others. There is a broader range of opportunities to cooperate if Biden wins, but we should nevertheless be ready for a different scenario and try to make the best out of it. One thing is for sure, domestic agenda, the COVID-19 crisis and its economic consequences, as well the social tensions in the country, will require much of the president's attention. The US, with Trump staying in the Oval Office or Biden winning, it are two very different pictures. In my capacity as a standing rapporteur for relations with the US, I would like to underline European perspective, hopes and fears. So where is Europe, not only individual member states, but as a project, as a whole, are in this picture? Probably the most important difference for Europe would be that, unlike Trump, Biden sees Europeans as allies in the geopolitical competition with more and more assertive China and Putin's Russia. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, and thank you also for all the work that you do, and indeed Mr. SIKORSKI does, to underline the importance for our common interests and our common values of transatlantic relations in the European institutions, and specifically, of course, in the European Parliament. And thank you for staying the course of this particular roundtable for almost 2 hours, which we hugely appreciate. It's a big chunk of time, I know, for anybody. Not least, of course, for our other panelists too. Thank you to Carroll, to Elaine, to Tara, to Bruce, to David for joining us. Thank you for sharing your insights. Thank you for putting your neck on the line to some degree, because you did come pretty close to making predictions as to what might happen. I know for any political commentator, not least for pollsters, that's always an adventurous thing to do. As I mentioned at the beginning, there is this rising tide of anticipation, even excitement, I would say, in Europe about what's going to happen next Tuesday. We may not know the result, of course, on Wednesday, but I think we'll have a clear sense by Wednesday whether it's broken one way decisively or not. We hope to have another one of these roundtables at some point after the result. We're going to wait until we know the result before we put that panel together and the exact timing of it. I'm told by what's called here Q&A support, which is in fact my advisor Stefan Reynolds, that at the very end of proceedings, after Joe Dunn has spoken, there will be a virtual round of applause in the sense that everybody who's on the call, and we've still got 125 people on the call right now, I think we peaked at about 190, we'll have a chance to clap hands, as it were, and we'll be able to hear each other in a common expression of support. And I think that's actually quite an important statement more generally in today's times, that we can have something where everybody can be heard at once. Thank you so much, everybody, and over to you, Joe.
Thank you very much, Anthony. I thought this was a terrific event and very stimulating indeed, as you just said. So perhaps if I could just compliment also what Mr. Pitzula said in his closing remarks. I think the event has vindicated your title, America's Moment of Destiny. So I think, as Tarna said, it is a critical moment. And in this time of uncertainty, we have possibly the most uncertain election in a long time. We heard from Elaine, Carroll, and Dave, different possible scenarios. So you could envisage a blue wave, a landslide, or you could envisage a narrow Trump victory. It was interesting that yesterday's Financial Times had an interesting article about the difference that Pennsylvania's Bruce's states, 20 electors could make to the election. And in fact, many of the paths of President Trump's re-election passed through Pennsylvania. And we actually had an interesting discussion here yesterday with Pennsylvania Republicans and learned about the phrase, which I was not familiar with, about Pennsylvania being Philadelphia and Pittsburgh with Alabama in between. So meaning that it's a very evenly balanced state, sort of 50-50%. So that President Trump has, in fact, a sporting chance of winning there. I think it's also, the discussion has shown that this is the most consequential election for America in a very long time. I think what Carroll said about 83% of people thinking that it really matters, and that was very clear in the convention. The Michelle Obama saying "vote like your life depends on it" is a message that seems to have been internalized, but equally on the Republican side, the Trump base is definitely energized, and I think all of it is translated into what looks like will be a historic turnout level. The early voting, I'm not sure what the figure is this morning. Yesterday it was 66 million, but it looks as though it's heading for the level, almost the total turnout in 2016. And I think, as many speakers said, it's going to be the most important election for Europe in a very long time. And of course, this is the most important aspect for EPLO as an office here, expressing in a very concrete way the importance the European Parliament attaches to relations with the US Congress and the link between our continental democracies, as our Secretary General likes to say. And I think this whole event shows how important and interlinked we all are, and how important the US election is for Europe and for the future of European Union and US transatlantic relations. But as well as that, maybe, since I'm obviously a very passionate observer here, maybe throw in a few other mosts. I think it's definitely going to have been the most expensive election ever. I read this morning that all fundraising records have been broken in a system where, as you know, financing is a core, but maybe the core element. And altogether, if you include all the congressional campaigns, I think $11 billion will have been spent on this election. And it's potentially also the most contested election. We know that both sides are lawyered up to the hilt. The Democrats reputedly have recruited 1,000 lawyers, and I'm sure the Republican Party is no laggard in this area either. And of course, memories of 2000 have been revived, and many constitutional crisis scenarios have been discussed. What will happen if the Electoral College goes this way or that way, or what will happen if multiple slates of electors are put forward. And just the last point, also looking out the window here on K Street, I can see that all of the businesses and banks are being covered with plywood. in anticipation of what might happen next Tuesday. And the papers say that the police are braced for the possibility of unrest, and also the election officers we've talked to in the last days in Michigan and Pennsylvania and other places, they're all prepared for, not just intimidation, which might come about because of the call for the Trump election watchers, as they're called, some of them armed. And of course, many of these states are open gun carry states. But also, as I heard this morning, it's not just that there are 130 million guns in private hands in the US, but that in recent weeks there has been a spectacular increase in the purchase of guns by all kinds of people, and linked, it seems, first-time buyers buying because of worry about unrest that could arise following the elections on Tuesday. So we're all hoping for a peaceful transition. But I mean, it does certainly boil down to the fact that, as you say, may not be a moment of destiny, but certainly a moment of decision, and a critical one at that. So I would congratulate Anthony for organizing this wonderful and stimulating event. I think the panelists were all uniformly brilliant, and I think that it was great to hear from our political authorities, from Radek SIKORSKI and from Tonino Picula, and this has been wonderful, and I'm certainly looking forward to doing it again after the election. So thank you, Anthony. Thank you all.